Why do you play video games? No, seriously, why do you play video games? Anyway, while you think about that, let me talk at you for the duration of this video about why I play video games, since you can't actually answer me anyway. That'd be kind of weird if you could. Anyway, for me, video games, besides being a bonding activity between my brother and I and a really cool way to pass time with friends, have been an outlet for stress relief, entertainment, and a way to escape the real-life woes that bother me, like paying bills, decaffeinated coffee, and racism, all equally woeful and shitty things. They also provide me a sense of accomplishment when life seems to be putting me through the ringer. When I eventually stopped tagging along to every gaming session my brother had and played more single-player games, I realized I love the sense of progress given by video games. Whether it was finishing a level that I had been stuck on for weeks, leveling up my character, unlocking new abilities and playstyles, or finding a secret I walked past a million times, it was really awesome. It gave me a sense of accomplishment and finality, especially when I did everything I wanted to do with the game before putting it away and maybe picking it back up a couple years later. Whereas fighting games and co-op games rely on either competition or collaboration, respectively, to fuel the experience, single-player games take a different approach, opting to instead give the player a goal to accomplish or a challenge to overcome. Multiplayer games reach their true potential with human connection as the final piece to the puzzle, while single-player games take a gamble on hoping the experience set out in front of the player is interesting, fresh, and worthwhile. This takes on various forms. Devs can shove a ton of content into a huge map, suffocating the player with hundreds of tasks, only a quarter of which are interesting. This is the open world approach, which has become more about giving the player menial tasks to do every 2 minutes rather than exploration, not you, Elden Ring, a trend set by the Ubisoft series Assassin's Creed and Far Cry and embraced by Shadow of Mordor and Watch Dogs. Oh yeah, that's also another Ubisoft game, huh? Another approach would be to put a set of trials in front of the player surrounding a high-stakes main story, rewarding the player with powers that could help with hardy challenges in the main game, also known as the critical path. In open world games, the critical path is almost moot most times, except when you have to complete a mandatory mission for a piece of gear. In more linear, less open games like Control, Nier Automata, and God of War 2018, the critical path is the gripping tale of mystery and devastation, with the hero tasked with solving the crisis. There's not exactly a timer, but the game pushes you forward either with plot beats that change the environment, with minimal diversions to dig into. While the player can complete these side tasks, it's not the main objective of the game because the assumption is the end will come eventually, unlike open world adventures. Side missions are more potent because they also hinge on the story and come fewer and far between, especially when compared to open world games. But forget all of that. The last approach, the one that's the focus of this video, is the roguelike or roguelite genres, which pull back on the story and permanent progression of the first two forms of single-player games we talked about and focus purely on gameplay and chance. Don't worry, I'll explain the difference between light and like in a second. Roguelikes are the closest thing we have to original video games. I'm talking the Contras and the Raidens, not that old, not like Pong or anything, but those games where you lost a lot of your lives and had to start from scratch. What is a roguelike? Well, according to the incredibly reputable source Wikipedia, a roguelike is a type of game, mostly single player, focused on permadeath, dungeon crawling, and procedurally generated levels. Often, roguelikes expect you to finish the game's critical path multiple times, either unlock items, unlock new characters, have new experiences, see a true ending, or build upon any permanent stats that may be available that carry over between runs. A recent example of this is the very popular Hades by Supergiant. Every playthrough is randomized to an extent, with some stats and treatments permanently increasing stats as they are unlocked. The goal is to exit hell, with the game getting tougher and tougher as you go. Enemies are buffed along the way, but the player receives temporary powers, items, and other upgrades that not only provide the player a way to fight back, but create an almost unlimited amount of possible playthroughs depending on loadout, additional challenge accepted by the player, and random events that have a chance to happen each run. It's a novel concept that many games have done before the 2020 Game of the Year winner became such a hit, with more hardcore games like Spelunky and Risk of Rain expanding far beyond the concept gameplay-wise. The core to making good modern roguelike is having simple controls and a captivating but cryptic story. Now, I'm not picking on Hades or even the other subject of this video, my favorite PS5 exclusive of 2021, Returnal, but it seems that story is taking a front seat, hindering how emergent gameplay and expansive gameplay in roguelikes work. Now, why do I keep adding like to the end of rogue? Well, a lot of modern roguelikes aren't really rogues at all, but hybrid games with rogue-type elements. Let me explain. Dead Cells, a really slick Metroidvania-style 2D brawler, is also a roguelike with permanent death mechanics and the occasional upgrade. The Binding of Isaac, a game I really haven't spent much time playing, as you can see, is a twin-stick shooter with Zelda-inspired rooms and gameplay. The original Rogue, literally called Rogue, is an ASCII game that is the namesake for roguelikes. And guess what? The original Rogue had nothing like this. It was actually just a text-based adventure, as you can see on the screen. And Rogue really reset your progress. Like, I'm talking the whole game basically deleted itself. We're not talking a few hours, we're talking a whole playthrough. So roguelikes are easier in the fact that a lot of them have permanent stats. They're a lot more nuanced, and we can't really go just calling them rogues, right? They've kind of created their own genre of their own. Now, what truly makes roguelikes the shit, and a more modern take on the permadeath-ish mechanics of Contra and stuff like that, or that one Scooby-Doo game where you had to enter passwords. I hope somebody knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, the rewards, chance, and possible outcomes reward the player or make them have to think a lot about their next choices. Every time you play, the game is fresh. Similar things may happen, but no playthrough is the same. Players are rewarded for simply making progress and giving effort in a roguelike, whether it's making it to a new area you've never been to before, or completing an action over and over.
For instance, with the Binding of Isaac, there are literally hundreds of items to unlock throughout completing the game multiple ways with each of the 34 characters available, which you also have to unlock. You're also incentivized to pick up certain items during your run to match them with other items in a set, allowing you to transform, not only boosting your stats, but also unlocking more items for you to use. You're encouraged to solve puzzles so you can unlock secret locked characters, all while collecting endings and more toys for your metaphorical toy box to make future playthroughs more fun, varied, and at times more difficult. As a sidebar, this is kind of a thing a lot of games are missing these days, not just achievements. I feel like a lot of it has been replaced by achievement hunting. But really, roguelikes are one of the only types of genres left where you're actually left to unlock a lot of what the game is allowed to do. Like, imagine playing Mortal Kombat Deception and not having all of the characters, playing it for 3 hours, not finishing Conquest Mode, not completing any arcade towers, and saying that you've played the game and you understand all the game has to offer. That is simply not true, and that's not true for any roguelike, even though it's true for a lot of different games that come out these days. I mean, hell, fighting games really have most of the characters unlocked, if not behind a paywall, so there's really not even any anticipation besides, I guess, going through actual real life obstacles in order to unlock the character with your money, but that sounds a lot more morbid than I want to admit. If anything, roguelikes grow with the player, unlike a lot of other games. No one save file is the same, and each player is on a mission to either chip through each piece of content or just jump in for a fun time. They boil video games down to what they should be: fun, challenging, simple to pick up, a lot of stuff to unlock, and difficult to master. Now I know what you're saying. Pico, how is that any different than any other collectathon or content-stuffed open world game? Well, imaginary smartass, the variety for one. For instance, let's take an open world game I actually like, Elden Ring. Elden Ring is not random. Yes, funny things may happen to you that you never expected, but is usually just as likely to happen in every player's game. You beat Stormveil Castle, you move on to Limgrave, and so on and so forth, in whatever order you like. There's a massive amount of content there to explore, but if you were to start the playthrough over, the only thing you could really change is your character build. There is no new starting area, there are no different bosses, there are no random challenges added on top of the normal skill gap unless you mod the game. Elden Ring will be the same every time you play it, minus the actual partial differences in where the player may go first or last. It's not procedurally generated, it is a straight to the point game. After beating the game multiple times, the well is dry and there won't be too much reason to visit the game or revisit the game unless there is a lot of DLC or the game is, not fresh on your mind and you want to revisit it. Roguelikes, even if you've unlocked all of the items and seen all the endings, are a legitimately random game. It's like a no-cost casino, but for your brain, right? Like, it gives you these dopamine rushes every time you flip the switch to turn the game on, and then you die, or you try to retry. Like, it's a different experience every time. You're thinking differently every time. What item is around the corner? How are these two items I've never had before synergize? How powerful will I be if I try to get to this boss before I go to try to beat this boss? It's a lot of different ways to route your playthrough. There's a lot of different ways to think things through. I mean, this is why guys like Sinvicta and Northern Lion can play these games for like 800 episodes. You can't do that with a lot of other games. And I'm not even just talking about content creation, I just mean longevity. In 10 years, I could pick up Isaac and have the same fresh experience I have today. I couldn't say the same about Elden Ring, Elden Scrolls, or Grand Theft Auto. The other reason roguelikes are a more rewarding, addictive genre of gaming is the skill gap, which can vary from player to player. Every game with action or some sense of challenge has a skill gap, whether it's Halo, Guilty Gear, Dicey Dungeons, or Horizon Zero Dawn. At some point, you become fluid and flexible with the controls you are given, whether it's 2 analog sticks or the entire controller. But then it's up to you how you finesse your way to the end of these games, as well as our good friend RNGesus. Other games simply don't do this the way that roguelikes have, even all the games I mentioned before. And the reason that roguelikes offer that a little bit extra of a skill gap to conquer is that it's different, right? Like, you know that there are a lot of different enemies, but you don't know what combination you're going to see them in. You don't know how you're going to have to dodge. You don't know what cards work with other cards because you've never seen them in the same place before. You don't know if this item combined with this item is going to make your character really fucking weak, or it's going to give them a gigantic hammer that's going to let you crush everything metaphorically. It all depends, and it will be different every single time you boot the game. So now that we've established what roguelikes are, what is the problem with modern roguelikes like Hades and Returnal, and why they don't scratch that same itch the way your very true to the formula approaches do? Earlier I mentioned both Hades and Returnal, two games which received an incredible amount of praise within the past several years, deservedly so, in part due to how their design factors into the core story. But I have a problem with this. They are not roguelikes. These games do a few things great. Hades has an amazingly simple yet satisfying combat system and loot system, allowing for dozens if not hundreds of builds and playthroughs that can either be a breeze or force the player to think harder about which items they take. There's a ton of content to keep you playing besides the story, with mods for weapons, additional difficulty, options galore, and a ton of social relationships to forge along the way to further flesh out the story. Returnal provides one of the most eerie, exciting, and mysterious environments I've seen in gaming in ages, capturing the hopelessness and untouched beauty of Atropos that Celine carves her way through with her cool sci-fi space guns. Gun controls are tight, Metroid-like tools and progression help the game move forward at the player's pace, nudging them to wonder why they can't reach an area and where they may find the tool that can help them, which is usually locked behind a boss or an area that hasn't yet been explored because you haven't beat said boss. Returnal runs can be beaten in minutes or hours, with boss skips available, tools that allow starting areas to be crushed in record time, and a skill gap that begs you to learn how to dodge and shoot at the same time. Without spoiling your title, the concept of dying over and over while remembering every previous attempt and learning from past battles is the main driver for the plot. Zagreus is attempting to escape his dad's house, or hell, to see what's on the other side with his godly relatives, while using his immortality to try again and again every time he fails. Celine is doing her damnedest to escape the alien planet Atropos in one piece without dying and restarting the time loop, all to get back to her family. The powerful part of both of these games is the insurmountable goal that sits in front of you, and it's up to you to conquer it. Reaching the true ending of both of these games requires more than beating it once, which is a great incentive to pull players along the nose for a few chunks of story. The thing is, both of these games are so entrenched in attempting to make the player care, a job I think Hades does much better than Returnal, by the way, that the games end up feeling empty once the conclusion has been reached. It's almost nukes the concept of them being any more than simple single-player adventures, cosplaying as modern roguelikes with a few bells and whistles. Like, the whole draw of the games that I mentioned earlier, dying over and over and learning from your mistakes, is literally the driving force behind every other roguelike. So when you think about it, the core thing that these games try to sell you on to make them different really isn't that different from a lot of other games in the genre that offer a lot more content. And it's not, oh, these games have uploaded and overloaded their games with so many different things that it's overwhelming. It's more so the fact that you're hiding the gameplay behind this thing that a lot of other games don't hide the gameplay behind, if that makes sense. Yes, you can play Hades after you reach its final conclusion after successfully beating the game 9 times. But with that taking less than 100 hours, realistically taking most players less than 50, very short for a game that bills itself as a roguelike with infinite replayability, it really kind of gets stale. After you find that last cutscene, you know, the thing that was pushing you the entire time to finish the game, you're kind of just expected to 100% it. Returnal has the same issue. Yes, after the initial credits roll, there is even more content, and I'm not even talking about the added-on multiplayer mode. I'm talking about a true ending that is hidden behind random collectibles placed in different parts of the area. So not only are you backtracking through a bunch of areas you already played, which in Returnal have a lot less variety than they do in even Hades, you're doing it all technically for one more cutscene after you already saw the big reveal after those first credits. And it is a big one in Returnal. That makes the player question why they're even playing in the first place, which was its intention. For both of these games, this gameplay loop pales in comparison to other roguelikes. Even older titles like Spelunky, or more popular ones like Risk of Rain 2 that don't even show you more than one cutscene before you press play, let alone halting the action for dialogue or a cutscene, something both Hades and Returnal do regularly. Yeah, there's a vague reason your spaceman is trouncing his way through planets to crack open portals and release insane bosses, but most players could give less of a shit because it is not the selling point at all. If your players reach the end of the road you put in front of them, a road that only has 1 or 2 paths, why bother playing after the climax is passed? Why, of course, for the chance to unlock more weapons and paths. Well, smart-ass watcher, both of these games also lack post-game content by the tons. Hades has no alt paths, and for anybody who wants to know, alt paths are alternate paths in the game that you can take, in a lot of the roguelikes, that lead you to different things, whether it's a different boss, a different ending, or just a harder version of the game in a different path. And guess what? Returnal also has one of these. Just one. I will give them a pass for that. But even with one alt path, neither of these games have more weapons to unlock after the credits roll, nor are there any limits on leveling up that are increased at the end of these games. There is only one protagonist in each game, mixing the chance for multiple characters to spice up the gameplay. Also with these games, there's a very small set of bosses, and you basically see them in the exact same order every single time you play the game, and that is a huge thing in a lot of other roguelikes, is seeing a lot of different bosses, a lot of different ways to encounter things, and these games don't have that. When compared again to the multiple branching paths of all the modern examples that I named earlier, like for instance the original Binding of Isaac Rebirth with none of the DLC, it's a little frustrating for a $70 game like Returnal to provide so much less for the player. Not only does the story take the wind out of the sails, there isn't a lot of content to sneeze at. This isn't all about quantity. Now, I'm not saying that I want Returnal to have 300 guns or have Hades let me play as the rest of the sexy cast, although that would be pretty fucking cool, because that would kill the goal of both of these games. It would kind of make the story moot and would kind of make it not make as much sense, right? I am simply saying dubbing these games roguelikes, like or not, is misleading to the fans of the genre. They merely borrow from the genre. To me, this is akin to calling Dragon's Crown a fighting game, Guilty Gear's Mom Mode an RPG, or calling Elden Ring just a straight platformer. Hell, it's like calling Mortal Kombat 11 Story Mode or Tekken Bowling a full $60 experience if they were packaged by themselves. It's like calling any game with a rolling mechanic and big bosses a soul. Oh shit, oh fuck, we already do that. Fuck. These games, Hades and Returnal, are single-player action games that borrow from roguelikes. They are not roguelikes. Returnal is a little more true to the storytelling aspect of rogues, with a mostly sparse story spread through text and cutscenes, only playing the first time a big set piece is experienced. Hades is a great game, but Supergiant clearly cared more about crafting their goofy, simple, challenging, addictive romp through hell with the genre itself as a backdrop. It's not the point. The point of it was all of their voice acting, the funny dialogue they have, the story they want you to find after beating it those 9 times. But the game falls apart after the credits, if that's all you care about. Meanwhile, with other roguelikes, if you were looking to just see the credits, well then you're missing out on about 95% of the fucking game. The one bonus I will give these games is the lack of pure frustration, especially for Returnal after it got an update that added mid-level saving. Roguelikes can piss you off, easily, for making you spend 3 hours of time fighting through dungeons only to get slain before you reach your new milestone, effectively making some of it moot. Hades has a minimal amount of bosses with limited routes, as does Returnal, so you won't feel like you're missing much after you complete your first full playthrough. After the credits roll, there isn't much main game to see that you haven't already, so there's nothing to be frustrated about. Meanwhile, I am over 120 hours into the Binding of Isaac and cannot for the life of me unlock a specific character behind a super hard challenge. For those who want to save their time, this is a boon. Now don't get me wrong, I still play Hades and Returnal, for sure, but not to be surprised or see a new side of it or to unlock something new. It's to complete a checklist or to see the story from the beginning if I missed it. So rather than trying to ride the tidal wave set by Isaac, Spelunky, Gungeon, and others, the two would be much better billed as time loop based adventures, not roguelikes. They succeed with closing loops and finding finality, not encouraging replayability or experimentation outside of the rote ways they tell players to approach it within the first several hours. The skill gaps are there, but if you get good enough to beat the game a few times, then you're good enough to close the previously mentioned time loop. There is no challenge like there is with roguelikes, nor the slot machine-ish aspect to loot drops. The excitement for loot plummets hours before it does for other games in the genre. But at the same time, it's important to understand that the games didn't fail in their original goal, telling a tight story with pieces that the player has to put together through triumphant wins. They are great standalone experiences that play to their strength. Story before gameplay, with the story always on the front lines, and that is commendable. It's just, that's what makes these games your standard linear adventure games instead of true roguelikes. These games end. Roguelikes do not end. So yeah, those two games are great and deserve to be played, but what gems are waiting out there for someone who is looking for more after finishing their first roguelike, which happened to be Returnal or Hades? Here are some suggestions based on what I think a modern roguelike should have, which are the following. Tight controls, loot galore, multiple playstyles and paths, permadeath mechanic with randomization, permanent unlocks limited, and a story that is a backdrop or a simple challenge, not an end goal. And, some of the extra things these may have include daily challenges and consistent updates. So, first off, let's get to Isaac. Isaac has all of the above and is considered a huge influence on the genre since the Rebirth version came out in 2014. You can only beat one main boss for your first chunk of the playthroughs, but this game will require more than a dozen finished runs to even start unlocking more paths, which unlock more characters, which unlock more items, which unlock more challenges that unlock more items, and that's all before you get to Greed mode, a wave-based mode that has its own set of unlocks and a specific character unlock. All of this wrapped up in, I shit you not, a twin-stick shooter. Glorious and easy to pick up, but also very hard to master and more importantly, strategize. Strategy is a highly valued, but less publicized in my opinion, skill that you need for Isaac. You have to work with randomness to get the game to do what you want it to do. You can re-roll items, skip floors, unlock branching paths by speeding to bigger bosses, and even plan your entire strategy around losing health and dying. It's a pretty robust, easy to pick up roguelike that is a good answer for the question, what is a modern roguelike? I will say, the content itself behind the gameplay may not be everybody's thing. For one, you play as a naked baby named Isaac in many of his variations, but there's also a lot of body horror, old memes, insensitive jokes, and straight up potty humor throughout. And I mean, the entire plot centers around a child running away from his religious fanatic mother who he thinks is trying to murder him. There are also a lot of references to suicide, religious fanaticism, and child abuse throughout. I've played Isaac on and off since about 2014, and I was a Newgrounds kid, so a lot of that has kind of faded into the background for me, personally. But this is a game that has some decently gross and off-putting content to it, so I get it if it's not your thing. If you like the gameplay but don't love the content, I would suggest to Enter the Gungeon, which is very similar. I personally think Isaac is just better and does a lot of things better than Gungeon, but Gungeon is also a time sink of a wonderful game, and you should give it a shot if you've never played it. Now, if you're looking for something a little more strategic and less active, I would suggest the recent and excellent Slay the Spire. Slay the Spire is a deck-building roguelike that can have multiple playthroughs lasting anywhere from 20 minutes to a couple hours, depending on who you are. There are multiple characters, a fun D&D vibe to it, and the art style will age excellently, in my opinion. And the same goes for Loop Hero, a digital Devolver published game where you build a dungeon for your character to travel through loop after loop while you collect materials on your journey to flesh out the open world. Meanwhile, you manage your hero's difficulty from a bird's eye view while you build a dungeon around them. It's got an amazing soundtrack, an addictive gameplay loop, a great art style that I can't really get enough of, and worthwhile dialogue and exposition gained from progressing through the dungeons and using new combos of cards. Oh yeah, and this one is also a deck builder, and I highly recommend it as well. Lastly, I'm going to wrap this up with an honorable mention of what some think is the best roguelike, and I just personally haven't put enough time into recently, and that would be Risk of Rain 2. Risk of Rain 2 is incredibly simple and deep at the same time, just as much if not more than Isaac. You pick a spacefaring adventure, get plopped onto the surface of a planet, and make your way through portal after portal, facing waves of enemies and a big baddie at the end of every level after you activate said portal. The characters are varied, the story is cryptic, and the characters you do meet are funny and fascinating. And it's really well put together when the game has you have different branching paths that you have to find through just playing the game. And once again, the adventure is what makes the game work. You don't know what's going to happen when you boot the game up. You can find a ton of chests with stat boosts and cool gadgets on the first planet, or you get jack shit and get owned by the boss. Runs can last minutes or hours, which is perfect if you have a few co-op partners, which this game allows. Combine that with a nice modding community and a few recently released expansions, and I can see why people still like this game. And it's really, really fun to play. And guess what? They also have a mod, so you can, thank God, save the game and leave it if you're on PC. Now, if only I could personally finish more than one run. Roguelikes are unique in that they use rewards as a consistent gameplay feature, and not one that requires you to restart the game all the way from the top to feel it again. They can give you the same feeling of beating a hard boss time and time again with different options of play and routes. It's like having that first time experience every single time you open the game, and it's a genre everyone should dip their toes in, at least for a while, especially when the world is in such an awful place right now. Feeling like your life isn't going anywhere, you can't really affect a lot of things, boot up a roguelike and live a few different lives, have some success, and be glad you didn't hit the casino instead and lose all your cash. Then maybe get back to it and see if there's some things that have a different perspective on them after you've, destroyed a god in one of these games. Maybe life won't be so hard after that. Thank you for tuning in and listening to my experience as a scrub who's learning to use video games as therapy along with my regular therapy. I'll be back with another video soon, so if you want to tune into that, subscribe to the channel. What's your favorite roguelike? Do you like roguelikes and why? Or if you don't like roguelikes, why do you hate them so much? Anyway, all my socials are on the screen. Y'all have a good day. Hit me up if you want to talk. See ya.